Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We're happy that you could join us again, and we're still waiting for colleagues to join us. We will start shortly. Meanwhile, you can probably start writing down your names and your organization and the country where you come from. We will start shortly. Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. We welcome you all, particularly those of you joining from far away or at very late or early times. Thank you for joining this WHO EPI-WIN, Plague in the 21st Century, New Evidence to Control a Re-emerging Zoonotic Disease. For those new to EPI-WIN, this is the WHO Information Network for Epidemics for Science and Knowledge Translation in Health Emergencies. Our goal is to translate science in accessible, understandable, and relevant ways for evidence-informed actions and decisions in health emergency preparedness and response. Today, we have a great panel of experts to discuss and share with us about plague in the 21st century, new evidence to control a re-emerging zoonotic disease. My name is Lester, and I will be your host for today's webinar. To give a quick overview of what to expect today, we have listed the titles and the names of the speakers. We will be starting with Dr. Maria von Kerkhoff, Director, Emerging Diseases and Zoonosis, Epidemic and Pandemic Preparedness and Prevention from WHO. We will also be joined by Dr. Nicolo Binella from WHO. He will be also moderating the technical session. We will have colleagues from a project Imasui, a randomized controlled trial on bubonic plague. So we will have, later we will hear more from Professor Piero Oliaro, Director of Science, Isarik, University of Oxford. We will have Dr. Rindra Vatusowa Randremanana, who is an epidemiologist from Institut Pasteur de Madagascar. Dr. Miaja Raberaona from Centre Hospitalier Universitaire Joseph Raceta Befelatanana, also in Madagascar. And we will have a panel discussion to be moderated by Dr. Lorenzo Pezzoli. So before we proceed, here are some housekeeping and reminders. This webinar is being live streamed on the EPI-WIN YouTube channel. The webinar is being recorded, and afterwards, the recording will be available from our website. The address will appear in the chat. We invite you all to post your name, location, and organization in the chat box. We love to hear where you are joining us from. Also, if you have questions, inquiries, please use the Q&A box. You can find it in the bottom part. Please do not use the chat so that we can easily keep track of these questions. Keep your comments relevant to the topic and positive. Please avoid negative, rude, or disruptive comments. We will remove you from the webinar for disruptive comments. So we hope that we can keep these reminders during the webinar. And now it's the best time to start. I will hand over the floor to Dr. Maria von Kerkhoff for the opening remarks. After this, we will have a short Slido interaction. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Lester, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this EPI-WIN seminar. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome all of you here, which is an EPI-WIN seminar focused on plague. It's a disease that, despite being centuries old, continues to pose public health challenges in several parts of the world. Plague has claimed millions of lives. Many of you know from the Black Death throughout human history. And although modern medicine has equipped us with effective tools to control it, it remains a high mortality disease because the highest burden often occurs in remote resource-limited settings. This makes plague not only a medical emergency, but also a public health bacterial threat requiring swift and coordinated action. During the 1990s, the disease reemerged in several countries and is now recognized globally as a reemerging zoonotic disease. Its potential to spark large-scale outbreaks, as demonstrated by the epidemic in Madagascar in 2017, underscores the ongoing need to strengthen our preparedness and response efforts. In this context, the importance of a One Health approach in tackling the disease is essential, and I know many of you have joined several of our One Health seminars previously. Plague exists at the intersection of human, animal, and environmental health, with rodents and fleas playing a central role in disease transmission. Strengthening collaboration across medical, veterinary, and environmental sectors is essential in assuring effective prevention and control efforts. As you will hear later today from this excellent group of panelists, including several from my team here in WHO, at the heart of plague control lies surveillance, both in humans and animals, which serves as a critical tool to detect events early and inform public health action and community protection. Plague prevention and control is indeed a cross-sectoral effort requiring close collaboration and synergy across relevant stakeholders and includes rodent and flea control, community engagement, risk communication, early diagnosis, and prompt appropriate treatment. Today, we have the opportunity to reflect on recent progress and evidence. And one of the highlights of this session will be presentations from the finding of the, I'm going to say this wrong, but IMASOY randomized control trial. So I'm sorry if I was supposed to say that a different way, but you will correct me later on in the webinar, followed by a discussion on how this can inform our collective efforts to strengthen plague prevention and control strategies worldwide. Thank you so much for joining us today, particularly to talk about plague, but for joining us on all of these EPI-WIN seminars. I look forward to your productive and your engaging discussions. Lester, back to you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thanks for giving us a quick background of plague with its very long history and some of the challenges and important actions that we need to do now. As in previous webinars, we want to know a bit more about you, our participants. To do that, we have a short Slido survey, and I turn over to my colleague, Supriya, and while also we're showing the Slido survey slide. We request to remove the agenda slide so we can have the Slido survey. All right. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, we can see the screen already. Supriya, over to you for the Slido survey. All right, our Slido survey is number 3810915. So please join us at slido.com, 3810915. What are the first words you think of when you hear the word plague? Right, it's a very common word, but can mean a lot of things to many of us. And we see a lot of inputs already coming in. Thank you so much for joining. Slido.com, 3810915. Great to see that many of our knowledge here is about Black Death, rats, and fleas. You can still keep on answering the Slido.com with this number. I think we can also already return to our webinar. So thank you so much, Supriya, and thanks participants for joining us in this quick Slido survey. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn over to Dr. Lorenzo Pezzoli. He will be moderating the technical session, so including the next topics. Over to you, Lorenzo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lester, and to the EPI-WIN team for hosting this webinar. And thank you, Maria, for the powerful opening remarks. I also enjoyed very much looking at the Slido. I really wish we could have kept it a bit longer, but I guess this is recorded. I enjoyed looking at the Slido word and what people think when we say plague. And as we highlighted, plague is a disease that is still with us, and that continues to affect some of the most remote, underserved communities in the world. We on purpose said plague in the 21st century as a title because plague may be forgotten by many. In fact, actually, if I look at the attendance of this seminar, perhaps not the people attending here, but in fact, when I advertised this webinar in my network, many friends and colleagues were surprised. They asked me, plague, is it still a problem? They were surprised that we were working on plague, and WHO was focusing on this. And this is because I think outside of the global health community, most of the world associates plague with history, to something that happened a long time ago. The Justinian plague of the 5th century, the Black Death of the 12th, 15th century, and so on. And while most of the world may have moved on from plague, after all, it is a flea-borne disease that is treatable with antibiotics. And thanks to modern medicine, it's not really a frightening prospect to most of us. Not everyone shares this good fortune. Plague and other epidemic bacterial diseases, actually, as a matter of fact. Think another one that evokes a lot of history is cholera, which is, of course, an historic disease, but is afflicting the world already today, also today, continuing to bring a really very real pain to these communities around the world that unfortunately lack access to healthcare and diagnostics. And today, the session is exactly about that, how we can connect with global strategies from the experts, the global experts, to the frontline realities, and showing how new evidence gathered through partnership can protect the communities better. Because outbreaks start and end in the communities, so the control of outbreaks must also start and end in the communities. And we have two parts of the session. The first one is my colleague, Dr. Binello, will walk us through WHO's strategy to control plague, and then we'll listen to our colleagues from Madagascar who have conducted the Imasui trial and provide this new evidence to control the disease. So without further ado, I give the floor to Nicolo for the first part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, and I hope you all can see my screen by now. As always, it's a pleasure to be here. So as part of this presentation, I'll briefly provide an overview, as Lorenzo mentioned, of plague and its control strategies as currently recommended by WHO. The causative agent of plague, as a way of background, is Yersinia pestis, a non-motile capsulated gram-negative coccobacillus, and when stained with some certain types of dyes, aniline dyes, the ends of the bacillus absorb the stain more intensely, and this is a phenomenon called bipolar staining, which gives the organism the typical appearance of a closed safety pin, which is partially shown in this photograph. Yersinia pestis belongs to a group of bacilli with low resistance to environmental factors, meaning that sunlight, high temperature, and desiccation quickly destroy the bacteria. Now, let's talk about reservoirs and vectors. So wild rodents are the natural reservoir of plague, but they're only seldom involved in human transmission. They're susceptible to infection, but normally do not develop disease manifestations. Rats, or prey-domestic or commensal rodents, on the other hand, are more commonly involved in human transmission and usually develop the disease. Hence, the phenomenon of rat falls. A rat fall basically is usually defined as having more than one dead rat in a house, or more than one house with dead rats in cases with it has been proven that the deaths have not been due to poisoning. That being said, fleas are the vectors of plague, and species of Xenopsilla, particularly Xenopsilla chiopis, are the most prevalent vectors for humans and commonly infest household rodents in many parts of the world. Fleas tend to avoid light, hide in dark, warm places, the feathers or fur of animals, or in human clothing and bedding sometimes. Most flea species prefer feeding on one or two specific hosts, typically animals, but when their usual host isn't around, they do not hesitate to bite humans or other animals instead. Now, trying to really understand the transmission of plague, plague is maintained in nature through what we call the zoonotic cycle, which includes both the sylvatic cycle and the urban cycle. In the sylvatic cycle, the bacteria circulate at low levels among wild rodents that are partially resistant to the disease, and this is what we see on the left side of the screen. In the urban cycle, the bacteria circulate among commensal peridomestic rodents, including rats, living near humans, as shown on the right side of the screen. But occasionally, things change and outbreaks occur in animal populations. During outbreaks in animal populations, many wild rodents die off, forcing their infected fleas to look for new hosts. And this is when the risk to other animals and humans increases. Fleas may also turn to more susceptible mammals, which we call amplifying hosts, bottom of the screen here, which include rabbits, hares, wild carnivores, and domestic animals such as cats and dogs. And all of these animals can become infected by flea bites or by eating infected rodents. And in turn, they can pass on the infection to humans as well as wild and commensal rodents, further increasing human exposure. So how do humans get infected with plague? The most common route is indeed through flea bites. Either via the sylvatic or the urban cycle, plague transmitted through flea bites is usually responsible for a primary bubonic or septicemic plague. But flea bites aren't actually the only way plague can spread. Humans can also become infected through direct contact with infected animals by handling animal tissues or being scratched or bitten, especially by domestic cats. And again, direct contact with animals is most commonly responsible for bubonic or septicemic plague. And although it's less common, plague can also spread through respiratory droplets. And if a person or an animal, again, often a cat, is infected and coughing, individuals in close contact with them may inhale respiratory droplets. And this is the only way, droplet transmission is the only way plague can spread directly from person to person. In terms of epidemiology, it's really important to define natural foci. And natural focus refers to the presence of Yersinia pestis along with a suitable animal reservoir, rodents, as we just saw, and a vector, fleas typically, within a defined geographical area. And as we can see from this map, areas of enzootic plague include North America, former Soviet Union, parts of Africa, Asia, and South America. And since 2016, no new foci have been officially identified, but existing ones are likely to be expanding either into nearby regions or through the long-distance movement of infected reservoirs and vectors. Plague may indeed sound like a disease of the past, we saw the slide, but it does continue to pose a real public health threat today. And that's because large regions around the world still contain natural plague foci. And these natural foci can occasionally spill over into human populations, causing sporadic cases and sometimes leading to outbreaks. A striking example of this was the large-scale epidemic in Madagascar in 2017. And although the number of human cases has remained relatively low since 1945, plague made a noticeable comeback in the 1990s and is now classified as re-emerging disease. And since the year 2000, over 95% of all reported cases have come from Africa, especially from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Madagascar, which are and remain the most endemic countries today. The spread of plague in humans is definitely influenced by socioeconomic, environmental, and climatic factors. So I just want to talk about the fact that this is a disease of poverty on the one hand, and this is also a disease heavily impacted by climate change. Risk of exposure increases in the presence of unsanitary living conditions, occupations, and lifestyles involving close contact with animals, and traditional death rituals, which may involve handling infected bodies or gathering in groups. Also, while plague has obviously occurred globally, it is now mainly found in tropical and subtropical regions. And here, its transmission is limited by extreme heat and dryness, and incidence tends to increase during cooler months associated with high humidity. And finally, natural disaster, as well as human activities such as deforestation, mining, and so forth, can disrupt rodent and flea populations, increasing therefore exposure to and contact with vectors. Now, given the transmission modes and these considerations, we can already discuss most plague prevention and control strategies. And as presented in this picture, they do include surveillance and notification, flea control, rodent control, health education, and community engagement. And obviously, an important part is also played by diagnosis and treatment. And as a way of background, plague is strictly linked with international health regulations. The international health regulations require the notification of any event of a potential international public health concern within 24 hours of a country-level assessment. Plague cases should be notified only if the assessment done by the country shows that the public health impact can be considered serious and the event has at least one of the following features. 1, it is unusual or unexpected event. 2, there's a risk of international spread. 3, there's a significant risk to international travel. Or 4, there's a significant need to restrict trade. And this algorithm must always be used when there are cases of suspected pneumonic plague because of its potential to have a serious public health impact and spread rapidly. Also, it should be noted that it's not always necessary to wait for lab confirmation of plague. A suspected case of plague that occurs in an area not known to be endemic should be reported as an event to WHO. In the context of plague, which is a zoonotic disease, surveillance efforts should fully align with the One Health approach. And by nature, an effective plague surveillance system is multisectoral, encompassing monitoring of infection incidents in humans, flea vectors, rodent reservoirs, and even non-reservoir mammals that may seroconvert after infection, the so-called carnivore surveillance. And close collaboration among all of these surveillance actors is really crucial for fully understanding risks and vulnerabilities and enabling timely event detection and response. Animal-based surveillance aims to promptly identify plague activity among rats and other hosts. And as illustrated in this table, various methods are employed to detect these signals, each offering different levels of spatial and temporal precision, obviously. But as you can see, early warning signals indicating an increased risk of human plague can be gathered from surveillance in fleas, surveillance in rodents, surveillance in carnivores, acting as amplifying hosts, and even through identification of bacteria in host carcasses. When it comes to human surveillance, a critical role is played by case definitions. And these are the WHO standard case definitions of suspected, probable, and confirmed cases, which can be used as reference for notification under the International Health Regulations framework. And they should also be used for epidemiological investigation when possible and appropriate. Obviously, they can still always be adapted for local purposes depending on available resources. Now, controlling fleas is really one of the most critical steps in stopping the spread of plague, and it must come before any efforts to control rodents during an outbreak. And why? Because if you kill the rodents first, there's a risk that fleas will immediately seek out new hosts, potentially humans. And flea control should be initiated whenever there is any of the following warning signs, such as reports of dead rats suspected to be caused by plague, a noticeable increase in flea numbers or nuisance, and when the specific epidemiological indexes rise above the norm. And the fastest and most effective way to control fleas is through the use of insecticides, which should be applied to rodent runs, nests, burrows, in and around known or suspected plague areas, as well as in houses or surfaces as required. And these are typically applied as dusts or powder, what we call insufflation, or as low volume sprays, either residual or non-residual. And importantly, the insecticides must be safe for human use, and those primarily recommended include pyrethroids, organochlorines, and organophosphates. Now, rodent control is also a vital part of plague prevention and control strategies, and should be carried out primarily when there are no active outbreaks. In the event of an outbreak or in areas where plague is endemic, it should be coming after effective flea control. And several methods are recommended by WHO, including environmental sanitation, physical barriers, and chemical methods. Probably one of the most important rodent control strategies is removal of rodent habitat. And it's essential to eliminate rodent hiding places near houses, workplace, recreational areas, and that includes clearing brush, rock piles, firewood, and anything really that rodents could be using for shelter or food. Also, proper disposal of refuse is also crucial. Rodent proofing. As to rodent proofing, buildings should be made rodent proof whenever possible. Among physical barriers, live or snap traps are the most commonly used methods. Rodenticides are another option, particularly in endemic areas. And fumigation, on the other hand, is especially useful on ships and in cargo areas. Now, protecting communities from plague, or really any public health threat, goes far beyond public health interventions, medical interventions, and it starts with effective risk communication, infodemic management, and community engagement. And therefore, I really want to emphasize how critical it is to work hand in hand with communities to co-design and implement public health and social measures that are practical, culturally appropriate, and widely accepted. And in areas where plague is endemic, communities should receive health education on modes of human and animal exposure and preventive measure. And this is the list of typical health education messages that should be disseminated in endemic settings as well as during outbreaks. Post-exposure prophylaxis and contact tracing. So this should be considered only in specific situations where there's a risk of recent exposure to plague bacteria. And this includes, for example, individuals who may have come into contact with infected fleas. For example, there's a household member of a patient with bubonic plague, those exposed to plague bacteria, for example, through laboratory accident, or individuals who have handled or been in contact with an infected animal. In all such cases, if the exposure occurred within the previous 10 days, then antibiotic prophylaxis should be offered. And most importantly, prophylaxis is also to be considered for individuals who within the past 10 days have had close contact with any patient who is suspected to have pneumonic plague. First-line antibiotic options include ciprofloxacin, doxycycline, and cotrimoxazole, and duration is usually 7 days. Now, finally, a crucial period for plague control relies on prompt identification of cases and prompt treatment. But first and foremost, before any clinical assessment is performed, it's important to determine the baseline risk of the patient having plague. And the risk depends entirely on the patient's, or primarily on the patient's epidemiological history, and directly impacts clinical decision-making. So WHO offers guidance on this, categorizing individuals high, moderate, or low risk based on their exposure history. In terms of disease manifestations, there are 3 major primary clinical syndromes associated with plague: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. Bubonic plague is the most common, accounting for 80 to 95% of cases. Septicemic plague makes up about 10 to 20%, while pneumonic plague, at least primary pneumonic plague, is generally rare. There are also some less common forms of the disease, including pharyngitis, tonsillitis, and meningitis, which are even less common. But it's important to know that all forms of plague can progress to secondary septicemic, pneumonic, or meningeal plague, especially among cases that are not properly or immediately treated. And we're going to focus on these 2 major symptoms, bubonic and pneumonic plague, as shown in these 2 pictures. So bubonic plague is usually transmitted through flea bites. We mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, and has an incubation period of 2 to 6 days, characterized by the intense pain and swelling in a lymph node area. This is what we call bubo. And this is typically associated with fever. The case fatality rate is estimated to be between 15, 17 to 25, 26% for both treated and untreated patients based on data from confirmed cases of bubonic plague in Madagascar and Uganda. Pneumonic plague, on the other hand, is one of the most fulminating diseases known to mankind. Primary pneumonic plague is transmitted through droplets. We saw this before, and is considered highly contagious from person to person. Secondary pneumonic plague results from a hematogenous spread of bacteria to the lungs, usually due to an untreated infection somewhere else. The incubation period is 1 to 3 days, and clinically it's a severe pneumonia often associated with bloody sputum. The disease is fatal if untreated within 24 to 36 hours. And we're just going to zero in a little bit on bubonic plague because this is going to be the subject of the trial. And I just wanted to say that this is a febrile illness, often characterized by a painful lymphadenopathy, a swollen, painful lymph node, typically inguinal, which is more common than cervical or axillary, depending, however, on the inoculation site. Sometimes it might be preceded by an additional skin lesion called carbuncle, and there's a potential to evolve to septicemic, pneumonic, or meningeal plague if left untreated. Very, very important, laboratory testing. This is both important for diagnosis and surveillance. When plague is suspected, clinical specimens should be collected urgently, and treatment should not be delayed. Specific antibiotic treatment must begin immediately without waiting for lab confirmation, and specimens should be sent promptly to the reference lab, and it's essential that the lab is informed in advance of the shipment. And the type of specimen obviously depends on the clinical form of the plague, as outlined in this table. For suspected bubonic plague, the preferred specimen is aspirated fluid from the bubo. And this is a slide summarizing WHO recommendations in terms of lab testing. The diagnosis of plague is primarily established by isolating the bacteria using one of three confirmatory methods: PCR, culture, or serology. Let's begin with PCR testing. For species-specific detection of the Yersinia pestis, the assay must include at least 2 distinct target genes to ensure accuracy. A result is considered confirmatory or positive if both target genes test positive as well. Now, gold standard remains culture, the isolation of Yersinia pestis through culture, which is highly specific and allows for antibiotic susceptibility testing. However, we should acknowledge that culture is rarely feasible in field settings due to its technical requirements. And third, serology, which serves as a confirmatory test, particularly when there is a fourfold or greater rise in antibody titers between acute and convalescent serum samples, or when an initial negative result turns positive after at least 7 days. Microscopy is a non-conclusive test, but it can offer suggestive evidence of plague, and the detection of gram-negative bipolar stained bacilli is indicative, although not sufficient for diagnosis, because other bacteria can have similar appearance. For example, melioidosis bacteria have similar appearance. And finally, rapid diagnostic tests, RDTs. These are often used as first-line diagnostic tools in many countries. They offer rapid point-of-care diagnosis, which is critical for timely case management, but also immediate public health action. Using lateral flow immunochromatography, the RDT targets the F1 capsular antigen of the bacteria and provides results basically within 15 minutes in a qualitative manner. And here are the latest WHO recommendations regarding RDTs generated through the 2021 guidelines. In areas where plague is known to occur, WHO strongly recommends using these tests in people with suspected bubonic plague and suggests their use in individuals with suspected pneumonic plague as a tool to rapidly detect and implement the disease and implement public health control measures. During outbreaks, WHO suggests their use in people with suspected bubonic or pneumonic plague to provide rapid diagnosis at the point of care. But in both cases, due to the limited specificity, at least based on the evidence so far, WHO indicates that a positive result should always be interpreted with caution and confirmed via culture or PCR. Final slides on treatment, which links up to the next part of the discussion. And here are the recommendations for antibiotic treatment, which must be started as soon as possible without waiting for lab confirmation. The antibiotic regimen should be chosen based on the patient's clinical syndrome, disease severity, and drug bioavailability, and we'll go over the specific treatment options in a moment. But whenever possible, antibiotic susceptibility testing results should be used to tailor treatment. And in general, recommended duration is 10 to 14 days or longer, depending on the patient's clinical response. Which antibiotics? Well, it partially depends on the clinical syndrome and disease severity, but a regimen with a single antibiotic should be started in all patients with bubonic plague as long as they do not have signs of pneumonic or septicemic plague. And first-line antibiotic options include fluoroquinolones, doxycycline, and aminoglycosides. Fluoroquinolones have been used more recently than treatment of plague, human plague obviously, and offer several advantages over other aminoglycosides, including a favorable safety profile and the option for oral administration, which makes them especially suitable for use in a variety of settings, include remote or resource-limited areas. And by way of background, fluoroquinolones are ciprofloxacin, levofloxacin, and moxifloxacin here. When it comes to pneumonic or septicemic plague, WHO recommends using 2 antibiotics from 2 distinct classes, which means 1 fluoroquinolones on the one hand, ciprofloxacin, levofloxacin, or moxifloxacin, and an aminoglycoside, either gentamicin or streptomycin. We should say also that in suspected cases of pneumonic plague, antibiotic treatment should also cover for common pathogens that cause back pneumonia, for example, pneumococcal pneumonia. And in this context, fluoroquinolones are particularly useful and effective options due to their broad spectrum activity and good tissue penetration. And a final note on IPC measures. Standard precautions should be used to manage all patients with suspected plague. Droplet precautions and isolation should be implemented for all patients with suspected pneumonic plague, where source control should also be implemented through applying a medical mask to the patient when possible and obviously tolerated. And finally, it's really important to ensure safe body handling and burial practices at all stages, both in hospitals and communities. So I think I'll stop here. These are the two main reference documents that inform this presentation. Obviously, in 15 to 20 minutes, it's impossible to go into the details of plague control, but at least the aim was to provide a general overview across the board on plague control. And back to you, Lorenzo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niccolò. Indeed, here with all the EPI-WIN seminars, we are hoping to start a conversation, a global conversation. So seeing the amount of hands, I think you're doing just exactly that, and you have set the global context. Now we can move to the highlight of today's session, which is the IMASUI trial in Madagascar. This is not only the first randomized controlled trial on bubonic plague, but it's also a model of how research can be done with and for the communities most at risk. And I often, talk with Pierre and the colleagues, and they mentioned that this is indeed the first randomized trial in 5,000 years on plague. So congratulations for this effort. And we're honored to welcome three of the lead investigators, Dr. Rinja Ranjemana from the Institut Pasteur of Madagascar, Dr. Mihaja Raberahona from the Centre Hospitalier Universitaire Joseph Razeta Befelatanana of Antananarivo, and Professor Piero Liaro from the University of Oxford. And in case you were wondering, IMASUI is actually the acronym of a Malagasy phrase. I will not try to repeat it with my Italian accent, but it translates beautifully to let's focus. So on that note, let's focus on these groundbreaking results and how they can inform our plague and control strategies, prevention and control strategies globally. Over to the colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, WHO, for organizing this webinar. And without further ado, we'll start the presentation, which will be made by the three of us. Can you see my slides? Is that okay? You see my slides? Lorenzo?
Yes.
Right. Okay. I'm going to skip on, the first slide because all the data has already been presented by WHO colleagues earlier. I just wanted to point to the fact that to what I would call the plague paradox, because in spite of being an infection that has literally plagued humanity for the past 5,000 years, it has taken a long time for the causative agent and for the flea vector to be identified. This was only done at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the third pandemic, the modern plague. And the same applies, as it were, to clinical evidence for treatment. And this is exactly what we have been trying to address with this trial. The current treatment guidelines are based on very weak evidence, in the sense there's been no conclusive randomized controlled trials so far. The drugs that have been approved for the treatment of plague, for instance, by the US FDA, are based on experimental evidence, the animal rule, and there are a series of challenges that we, as well as the other groups that try to do clinical trials on plague, had to face, including the fact that the clinical presentation has been poorly characterized in the literature, that there was no prior established clinical trial methodology, agreed endpoints, and of course, we, like others, had to face serious logistical challenges. Why Madagascar? Madagascar because it's the country that is reporting more cases than any other in the world. According to 2018 WHO data, more than 90% of the total number of cases were between Madagascar essentially and DRC Congo. Plague arrived in Madagascar with the first wave of the modern plague pandemic at the end of the 19th century. It's endemic in rural areas and occurs normally between August and April during the dry season. Nicola previously mentioned the case fatality ratio, which is in Madagascar has been during the 2017 outbreak, which is an exceptional outbreak, an urban outbreak, to be around 24-25% for both bubonic and pneumonic plague. Otherwise, after that epidemic between 2018 and 2025, as of today, there are approximately 160 suspected cases of bubonic plague cases per year, of which about half are confirmed, with a case fatality ratio for bubonic plague around about 18%, which is pretty much around the WHO estimate. Imasui, so we compared two regimens that are recommended by the WHO and by the CDC and are in the Madagascar guidelines. So these two regimens are 3 days of an aminoglycoside followed by 7 days of ciprofloxacin, and this was compared to 10 days of ciprofloxacin monotherapy. The study design that we used is non-inferiority, and this requires a little bit of explanation. It's very difficult to prove that two regimens are equally effective, statistically speaking. So we opted for this design, which is a non-inferiority, whereby you have to establish to determine what is called a non-inferiority margin. So if you look at this diagram quickly, so this line is where there is no risk difference between two regimens, and then this is the non-inferiority margin, which is the percentage difference that one is prepared to accept. If the 95%, if the upper bound of the 95% interval around the estimated risk difference is within that margin, then you declare your intervention to be non-inferior. If it exceeds that, then it will be inferior. In this case, it was 15%. And to do that, we estimated we needed at least 190 confirmed or probable cases. Now on to my colleague Rinj for the next bit. Thank you. Rinj, over to you.
Thank you, Piero. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. So during the implementation of the Imasui trial, we have allocated significant resources. So we have set up around 82 public health facilities in 12 plague endemic districts over 5 transmission seasons from February 2020 to March 2024. And these public health facilities ranged from public primary health center to district hospitals. And we collaborated with local health workers during data collection. We have deployed more than 40 research team members in the local community, and the local health worker supported us during the inclusion, during the information, and also during the follow-up visit of participants. And we have trained more than 200 health workers, and more than 1,000 community health workers. And on the left, you can see two photos, photos of rural area where plague case occurs, and the second photo shows an example of a primary health center. And on the right, we have the study site, the map showing the study site. In yellow, we have districts that have included confirmed and probable cases, and we can see that more than 8% of included cases came from 3 districts. Next slide, please. Suspected cases of pneumonic plague were included in an observational study, and they received treatment as per national guidelines, whereas suspected cases of bubonic plague who fulfill inclusion criteria and who gave their consent have been randomized, and they received either ciprofloxacin during 10 days or the standard treatment, which are aminoglycosid during 3 days plus ciprofloxacin 7 days. At the beginning of the trial, we have used streptomycin, but it was replaced rapidly to gentamicin because of unavailability of streptomycin internationally. And at day 11, we have conducted follow-up visits to collect data on primary endpoint. Our primary endpoint was treatment failure, defined as the occurrence of death or fever or the development of secondary pneumonic plague or the receipt of alternative or additional treatment for plague. And we conducted a follow-up visit at day 20 and month 3 and 1 year after the inclusion for serological follow-up. So during the 5 transmission season, we have screened 933 suspected cases. Among them, 450 have been randomized, 229 had received the standard treatment, and 221 had received ciprofloxacin alone. A total of 222 participants have been classified as confirmed or probable cases, and they have been included in the primary efficacy analysis. And among the 222 affected patients, 2 are probable cases. Next slide, please. And the randomized patients and the infected patient had similar characteristics in terms of age and in terms of gender. And all the patients had at least one bubo, mostly located in the inguinal region, and this bubo are painful. The median pain score was 7. Next slide, please. And we found that the percentage of treatment failure was similar in the 2 arms, 9% in the intervention arm and 8.1% in the control arm. And the adjusted foresight risk difference was 0.9%. The 95% confidence interval ranged from -6 to 7.8%. Next slide. And we can see in this slide that the adjusted foresight risk difference meet the non-inferiority criterion, as the 95% confidence interval was less than the non-inferiority margin. We have also conducted a sensitivity analysis, and the results were similar as in the primary efficacy analysis. Next slide. For the safety analysis, we conducted the safety analysis in the randomized participant and also in the infected participant. And overall, 13.8% had one adverse event, 3.6% had one or more severe adverse event, and 2.7% experienced an adverse drug reaction. And we found a similar percentage of patients with adverse events, severe adverse event, adverse drug reaction in the two arms. And the severe adverse event we have encountered were death, pneumonic plague, septic shock, and pupil rupture. The most common adverse event reported were diarrhea and vomiting, and all adverse drug reaction were mild or moderate. Thank you. I give the floor to Miada.
Thank you, Rinj. So we've also taken the opportunity to conduct this diagnostic accuracy assessment during this trial. So as was said before, bubonic plague diagnostic mostly relies on clinical evaluation and the evaluation of the epidemiological context. So people are treated based on clinical grounds, and samples are sent to central laboratory for PCR and culture, at least here in Madagascar. So an antigen F1 based rapid diagnostic test, as described by Nicola in his presentation, is routinely used in peripheral healthcare centers in Madagascar and also in central reference laboratory since 2002, and it was developed by the Institut Pasteur of Madagascar. So the objective of this sub-study is to assess the performance of this F1 RTT, but also to assess the entire diagnostic procedure of bubonic plague here in Madagascar. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, we've considered two sets of gold standards. So the first gold standard we consider was culture or PCR, which mimics what is done routinely. And among 438 suspected bubonic plague cases, 42% were confirmed by this first gold standard. When we consider a second gold standard that includes culture, PCR, and serology, and just to mention that serology is not routinely done because of logistic constraints, so 48% of among suspected bubonic plague cases are confirmed by this second gold standard. And you can see on the Venn diagram that importantly, 13% of confirmed cases are confirmed by serology only, meaning by seroconversion or the fourfold increase in paired sera of the antibodies. So here you can see the performance of the F1 RTT compared to the two reference standard that we use. The F1 RTT, as I said before, was done on site and in reference laboratory. So it is firstly done on site on the bedside, and then the rest of the sample is sent to the reference laboratory. And so you can see here that the sensitivity overall, the sensitivity of the on-site F1 RTT is a little bit higher compared to the one done at the reference laboratory regarding the two gold standards, but the specificity is lower compared to the one done at the reference laboratory. And the one done at the reference laboratory with regard to the gold standard 2 that includes PCR, culture, and serology had an 82% of sensitivity and an excellent specificity to 99%. So we've also assessed the performance of the clinical diagnostic. That is to say that the proportion of patient that is suspected at the beginning but end up to be confirmed cases, and we've done it and we've compared it across different age group, and you can see that among children less than 10, approximately 1/3 are confirmed cases, while it's 2/3 in aged more than 18 years of age. and it's about half between 10 and 15 years of age. Next slide, please. So what we can say is for surveillance, we have a set of tests that includes PCR, culture, and serology that should be combined daily to provide an accurate data for plague surveillance. But we have a strong caveat on serology because of its operational constraint. You need to send it to reference laboratory at 4 degrees Celsius, which is not really feasible routinely, and its cost also. And because it requires some multiple visits to the patient. We've highlighted that PCR outperforms culture, which was considered as a gold standard previously, but PCR and culture mostly cover all the confirmed cases. The F1 RTT that is currently used can be used in a peripheral laboratory with resource constraints for surveillance purposes, but unfortunately, this F1 RTT could not be used for case management because negative F1 RTT could not rule out plague, and the positive one could not really rule in the diagnostic of bubonic plague because you will need confirmation due to the high rate of false positive test result. But we should say that this sub-study was done in a setting where 50% of suspected cases are actually confirmed cases, and that's the negative predictive value, and the positive predictive value will be different in a lower incidence where you can have an excellent negative predictive value, meaning that if the F1 RTT test is negative, then you can rule out plague cases. So over to you, Piero.
Thank you all. And then wrapping up here, the overall conclusions. As Lorenzo said from the beginning, this is the first ever trial, randomized controlled trial that was powered to produce conclusive results. We managed to prove that ciprofloxacin alone is non-inferior to gentamicin ciprofloxacin, but the good news is also here that we have here two very effective evidence that there are two regimens that are very effective with by the way, a case fatality ratio in the study that was about 4%. And I wanted to point to the fact that, as we've seen before, mortality to bubonic plague is much higher in routine settings, and normally is around 18–19%. Importantly, ciprofloxacin alone, a 10-day regimen with oral ciprofloxacin, is significantly cheaper and easier to administer than the combination. The study, we believe that the study is a high internal and external validity because during the study we enrolled about 60% of all cases that were confirmed and or probable in the districts where the studies were done. So the spectrum composition is quite high, and the other good element in terms of also external validity is that the study was done at the health facilities. Patients were diagnosed and cared for by the local physicians within the system as per routine care. What might explain this difference in the fourfold reduction, 4 to 5-fold reduction in mortality is that presumably there was greater adherence by the prescribers, by the patients, including the fact that importantly, we involved community health workers who followed the patients when they were at home. And this is something that we want to explore further. So there are obviously important implications for policy and practice. And also, as Lorenzo said before, this is evidence that the WHO Resolution 74.8 on clinical trials and clinical research can be implemented even in very challenging conditions in low-resource countries. So we made this presentation on behalf of a whole series of colleagues and we want to acknowledge the fact that this would not have been possible without the dedication of research staff, but also the doctors and nurses at all levels of the health system in Madagascar, community health workers, and of course all the participating patients. We have already communicated the results immediately already last year to the Ministry of Health, disseminated also to local healthcare providers and communities. We have done restitution ateliers in the different districts, and the results will be published soon. We can't tell you yet because it's under embargo where and when, but watch out in the next couple of weeks before the mid-August, the results will be published. And of course, we want to thank all the institutions, and particularly the institution that funded this trial, the UK FCDO, and welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. We are now at time, but I think if you know, I would be happy to extend for 15 minutes of discussion as we had planned, and I hope that as many participants can join for this Q&A. So for me, thank you. For me, what I see is that, you know, plague was brought into the international spotlight recently, or fairly recently, with this outbreak in 2017, but in Madagascar, plague has been there for 100 years at least, and it's still there today. What changed in 2017 is that the outbreak moved to an urban center, and I think that kind of risk is present whether it's in Madagascar or in any other of those countries that continuously see plague, especially in sylvatic cycles. If plague reaches a largely unprepared urban setting, we may see an explosive outbreak again. So to guide the Q&A, I think that the question in my mind, at least, is what does the world need to know to prevent another outbreak like this to happen? And I see that there's already a few hands, so I'll give the floor to them. And we may want to take maybe three or four questions and then answer in batch like that. So let me just check. There's already four answers, so four hands. Let's take those and then see if there's time for others. So I see Mohamed first. Mohamed Mesekeni. Sorry, Supriya and colleagues. The colleagues can actually take the floor, right?
I think they're not responding, Lorenzo. So maybe an option is to also, we have questions that are in the chat box. We can probably also just read these and see if answers can be done. We can also do that.
Or we can see if the other person in the list can provide the question, you know, as a live question, like Ejid Kayaranga.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they cannot use their microphone.
Nobody can use the microphone. Eh?
Yeah. So we'll have to do with the Q&A box.
Okay, apologies for that. I was under the understanding that they could provide questions live. So it's a bit more artificial because I wouldn't know where to start with asking these questions. There are 32 questions in the chat box. Some have been answered. So for a discussion, it would have been
yeah. So maybe some interesting questions that we can find in the Q&A. Some may have been answered, but it would be a good idea also to reiterate, um, like the um, recommendations that are, to avoid the spread of plague, handling dead bodies, in traditional practices. And then also another question on disease transmission. Um, so maybe these kinds of questions we can also um,
I guess, okay, I will try to summarize then
yeah.
and provide some questions, directed to the speakers. I would focus especially on the colleagues from that just presented the EMA-SUI trial, since that's the hot topic of the day. And in summary, ask them to, discuss more about, beyond the scientific results, what lessons did you learn about working at the community level and taking this trial one step further, also in terms of strategic activities of plague control and prevention. So that would tie in also to the activities of safe burials and many of the questions that are asked in the Q&A.
So I would ask Mihaja to answer that question. Maybe before moving on to that one, I just spotted one that maybe we can pick up from DRC, where they say we continue to use doxycycline bubonic plague. What is a recommendation about this trial? So apart from the international recommendation, we are now looking into a follow-on to the EMA-SUI trial in Madagascar with additional research activities in Madagascar, now also in DRC, in the Ituri province, and we are hopeful that in the next few months we can start activities there as well, and hopefully start addressing the question about doxycycline. So perhaps Mihaja, if you want to take on and
Yeah, maybe a quick answer. So what we've learned, so as Per presented, one of the best examples is the mortality within the EMA-SUI trial, which is really, really low compared to what is known routinely in Madagascar. And this is basically due to the fact that, as Range presented before, we've worked together with community healthcare worker, actually thousands of community healthcare worker that engage with us to detect cases so that the cases can be treated as soon as possible, not more than one day, I think, in the EMA-SUI trial, if I remember correctly, the duration. And so this is an amazing achievement because you can even reduce the mortality of that disease when you strongly engage with the community so that they can work, you can have the patient treated as soon as possible and not wait too long before getting them treated. So I think it's something really amazing in this trial, and the mortality rate was 5%, correct me if I'm wrong, Piero, compared to approximately 20% routinely. So, it's not just the treatment effect, it's something else. It's the work with the community.
Thank you. And when we're talking controlling a disease like this, I think treatment and diagnosis are the fundamental pillars of a disease like this and any epidemic prone disease. So for the treatment part, I think in a way it's non-controversial. You show that the simple, way less expensive treatment is the way to go. This treatment is already covered in our guidelines, so I think that this provides further evidence about this life-changing intervention. what we could discuss more, I think, is the detection part. These diagnostic tools. They are developed by Institut Pasteur Madagascar, and I would like to discuss with the panelists and the colleagues that did run the trial, and potentially also Niccolò from WHO and our team, how can we ensure that, what would be the next steps to scale up diagnostics and on a global scale? Maybe we'll start with the colleagues from the Madagascar trial, and then Niccolò can complement.
It's a very hard question. Maybe I will refer to Piero, because this is a long discussion that we've started to dig in for months now.
So very quickly, it's extremely important, of course. And there are two aspects. One is what can be done with the available tools, and the other one is what new tools are required. Essentially, before we get there, we do need to delve a bit more into what is called the target product profiles of what sort of diagnostics is required and where. Because, as Mihaja reminded us earlier, the results that we got is in place about 50-50, so 50% of the suspected are confirmed, but there will be places where this proportion is much lower, and then you need a different type of test, or an epidemic, a big outbreak where this proportion is higher, and then even there you will need a different type. So in the next few months, and we are lucky now that we had received a bit extra funding to continue to work on plague. This is one of the things we want to address, looking into the type of diagnostics that will be required, and therefore hopefully guide the development of adapted diagnostics.
Thank you. And Niccolò, from your point of view, translating these results into policy and next steps.
Yes. No, thank you very much, Lorenzo, and thanks to the colleagues for the excellent discussion. I think that in order to respond to your question, I just wanted to provide like a broader health system type of perspective here, because as has been highlighted throughout this webinar, plague is a disease that sits at the intersection between different health sectors, medical, veterinarian, and environmental sectors. And in order to control plague, obviously diagnosis and treatment is absolutely critical, but all the other pillars of plague control should also be taken into account when developing a proper strategy, when developing appropriate policy for plague control. And in this context, there are new challenges in the public health arena when it comes to controlling plague in the 21st century. I saw there were a couple of questions about climate change and how this impacts plague transmission. Well, I kind of hinted at that during my presentation, but I can also, elaborate a little bit further, saying that, for example, when it comes to increased rainfall, that could lead to, development of vegetation where rodents would feed, and this would increase, obviously, the rodent population, and in turn, human exposure to some extent. So, and I could go on and on by providing different examples in, whereby, current challenges in this day and age do need to be taken into account when controlling plague. Now, down to diagnosis and treatment, my additional comment is that when developing guidelines, when developing recommendations for a single disease, obviously all the evidence regarding that specific disease is taken into account. But if we want to approach this in a slightly different way, by taking into account different public health challenges at the same time, including antimicrobial resistance, this could provide slightly different perspectives. So on the one hand, ciprofloxacin is already recommended as the first-line option for the treatment of plague, and I think this trial further corroborates that evidence, as Lorenzo, you just said. But at the same time, at least I think it's important not to disseminate the message that whenever you suspect a plague, even in areas that they're not known to be endemic for plague, that do not have natural foci, then ciprofloxacin or any other antibiotic, broad spectrum antibiotic, is the solution and to the problem, because not necessarily with regards to the implications of broad spectrum antibiotics for plague, but the implications, the public health implications, the broader public health implications of broad spectrum antibiotic on the gastrointestinal tract flora, on the genitourinary tract flora, on the skin flora, and so forth. These are some of the considerations that, in order to respond to your question, Lorenzo, I think need to be taken into account at the country, regional, and even international level when, advancing on plague control. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you. I hear you, and I think we're reaching the 15 minutes. What I hear is that, as we said at the beginning, it's a start of a conversation, and that puts, the communities that are affected at the center. We need to equip them with the right tools, and I completely hear you. It's about systems. Of course, epidemic starts with a patient, so diagnosis and treatment is the first step, but it goes way beyond that. We need a systemic approach that links the detection, the treatment to all the pillars from animal reservoir control, vector control, surveillance, etc. And this is extremely exciting. And I think that, as it was already reiterated by all the speakers, it's not a work that can happen in isolation. It's a work that has to engage the communities, from the communities to the global level, and it would not have been possible without partnership. And the turnout today is extremely inspiring to keep us motivated, all of us, and make sure that we provide the communities with the right tools to control this disease. As we said at the beginning, it is a disease that in most of the world has disappeared because we have the advances of modern medicine, hygiene, etc. But we need to ensure that these advances are taken everywhere, and especially to the most vulnerable communities. I thank you a lot for this inspiring presentation and session, and I give the floor back to our hosts, the EPI-WIN, to close. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo and Nicolo, Professor Piero, and other colleagues. It was a great discussion, a huge crash course also to remind us of the importance of plague, which is a very old disease. And at the same time, many of the challenges and recommendations in moving forward, how to control it globally, and with the many considerations, health system approach, systemic approach, and partnerships. So thank you so much for the discussions. Finally, we are at the end of our allotted time. I will wrap up by saying thank you very much to all our speakers and panelists today, the WHO colleagues who have worked hard on this, and the EPI-WIN team. EPI-WIN webinars are designed to provide updates and advocacy on critical areas. So there have been a lot of inquiries on certificates, and because of limited funds, currently we don't issue certificates. But we hope that you will continue to support and join EPI-WIN webinars, also for updates on medical and health knowledge. Big thanks to the working team who supported the preparations for this webinar, and also the WHO team on plague and emerging diseases, our colleagues from the IMASUI project, from the University of Oxford, Institut Pasteur, and colleagues from Madagascar. Finally, thank you all for coming and for your active participation, including participating in the Slido and in the Q&A. The recording of this webinar will be available at the EPI-WIN website. The link is given to you. An EPI-WIN digest and a slide set with key messages on this topic will be published as well. If you want to keep updated on future EPI-WIN webinars, recordings, and presentations, please subscribe to our mailing list. And we hope you will also join us for our next webinars. We have a few ones coming up in August. We have for RSV, respiratory syncytial virus sequencing. That will be on August 13. Another one, August 20, global applications of the Joint Risk Assessment Operational Tool. And another coming up, RCCE for cholera. So please stay tuned and be informed through our mailing list. Finally, thank you all and goodbye. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.